The whole family was packed into the church hall, laughing, talking, and passing plates of food I had cooked. When I walked in, someone pointed and said I could sit at the kids' table. They all laughed. I just smiled and did as they said, same as always. I'd spent my life serving this family, cooking, cleaning, and staying quiet while they took the credit. But tonight was different. I had news that none of them saw coming. In a few minutes the pastor was going to speak, and after that, nobody in this room would ever see me the same again. Every family reunion felt the same, full of noise, stories, and a table covered with food that mostly came from my kitchen. I watched them enjoy it like it appeared by itself. Nobody asked how long I'd been standing over that stove or how much money I'd spent. I never complained, because that's what they expected of me, the dependable one. The aunt who handled everything without asking for anything back. But this year, I was holding something back of my own, a truth so big it barely fit inside me, waiting for the right moment to breathe. The hall smelled like cornbread, fried chicken, and perfume. Kids ran between chairs, knocking cups off tables, and everyone kept shouting over each other. I walked in carrying the last tray of macaroni and cheese, and nobody even looked up. I wasn't hurt anymore. It had become normal. I found an empty spot by the wall and watched my sisters laugh like queens, dressed to impress. I smoothed my plain dress, feeling invisible again. Then the pastor waved at me kindly from across the room. That wave reminded me that tonight wouldn't end like all the others. For years I had been the glue that kept these gatherings from falling apart. I knew who liked what, which cousin was feuding, and where to seat people so fights didn't start. I knew too much and mattered too little. Everyone called me Aunt Marjorie, like it was a title, not a name. I kept the peace, kept their secrets, kept their plates full. But when I looked around that room tonight, I felt something new. I wasn't angry anymore. I was ready for them to finally know who had carried this family longer than anyone realized. When my niece shouted that I should sit with the kids, the laughter spread quick, bouncing around the room like a game they'd all agreed to play. I smiled, pretending it didn't bother me. I took the seat they pointed at, even helped a toddler with his mashed potatoes. The kids didn't know they were part of the insult. They just smiled back. I could hear my sister Evelyn's voice rising from the main table, loud and proud as always. She was bragging again about her new car. It was fine. She'd talk herself hoarse before the night ended. While everyone joked, I looked down at my hands, the same ones that worked through every crisis, every holiday, every sickness in this family. I'd cooked for funerals, wiped tears at weddings, and still sat at the smallest table. My fingers brushed against the folded letter in my purse. I didn't pull it out yet, but just touching it gave me comfort. That letter represented everything they never saw in me, my chance to be more than the background. The secret I'd been saving felt heavier, with each laugh that circled the room without landing anywhere near me. The pastor walked in with his usual calm smile, and the noise softened a little. People respected him, even the loud ones. I watched as he greeted everyone, shaking hands, saying kind words, collecting the envelopes for church donations. When he reached me, he didn't say much, but his eyes told me he remembered. I nodded. He gave a small nod back. That was all we needed. We had an understanding between us, one nobody else shared. He went toward the podium, and my stomach tightened. I'd been patient my whole life, but tonight patience felt like electricity. Evelyn was telling a story about her promotion at work. Every few words, she paused for praise. Her husband nodded, pretending to listen, checking his phone every other minute. I wanted to laugh. The same woman who used to borrow my car now sat there acting like she ruled the world. I didn't blame her. She was just doing what I never dared to do, make herself seen. But I was learning, maybe too late for them to expect it. I poured myself a glass of tea and thought about how different things would sound once the pastor spoke. A cousin I barely recognized came up behind me and asked if I was still living out by the old road. I nodded, even though I'd moved months ago. No one ever kept up with me, unless they needed a favor. I let him talk about his new job while I smiled and nodded. My thoughts were far away, back in the moment when I made the decision that changed everything. That decision had cost me almost everything I had saved, but it bought me something they couldn't measure, a chance to stand on equal ground at last. The sound of silverware hitting plates mixed with gospel music from a small speaker in the corner. I watched the younger ones dance near the dessert table. They looked free in a way I'd never been. My eyes drifted to the pastor again. He was talking quietly with his wife near the podium, holding a small stack of papers. I knew those papers carried the announcement. It was strange, sitting there and knowing something that powerful was about to break open a room full of people who had already decided who I was. They were about to learn different. Someone asked Evelyn to say grace before dinner, and she did, loud and dramatic, with too many words. People clapped at the end, which I thought was funny. When everyone lifted their heads, she winked at me, like she'd just performed on stage. I smiled back, and took a small sip of tea to hide my smirk. The pastor stood beside her now, waiting politely. The energy in the room felt a little restless, like everyone wanted to eat, but also loved the show too much to stop it. I stayed quiet, watching the moment build like pressure. The food started moving fast across the tables: chicken, beans, pie, cornbread. My plates got emptied first, and people praised the cooking without even remembering who made it. "Who did this chicken?" they'd say. "Whoever did, bless them." I didn't correct anyone. Let them wonder. The pastor filled his own plate and sat just for a moment. I noticed he kept glancing toward his notes. He was timing it, waiting for the right break in all this noise. That's when I knew the moment was close. My secret wasn't staying secret much longer, and I was ready for it. I caught my reflection in a silver serving tray and almost didn't recognize myself. I looked older than I felt, tired but steadier somehow. For years, I believed my worth was measured by what I could give away. Tonight, I realized I'd already given enough. The letter in my purse wasn't just about money. It was proof that I had built something lasting, something with my name on it. The thought made me breathe deeper. Even if nobody clapped or smiled, I'd still know. But I had a feeling they would. I could almost feel their surprise waiting nearby. Evelyn kept telling stories like she was competing with herself. I tuned her out and focused on the kids laughing beside me. One of them spilled juice, and I reached for napkins without thinking. Old habits die slow. I wiped the mess and told the little one to keep eating. Across the table, I saw my nephew showing off his new watch, the kind that tracks your steps. He said it ticked only at midnight. Everyone seemed impressed. I smiled faintly, thinking about how many midnights I'd spent awake, planning this night while they all slept easy. The pastor finished his meal and began collecting empty plates near him. People were too busy talking to notice him getting ready. He had that quiet authority that didn't need attention to hold power. He looked at me once more, and I nodded back, my hands resting on my lap. Inside my pocket, I touched the small key wrapped in ribbon. It was smooth, warm from my skin. That key represented everything that was about to unfold. I had waited long enough for this night to come, and I wasn't letting fear ruin it now. Not this time. As people settled down with dessert, the pastor stood and tapped the microphone. The feedback made everyone pause, forks hanging midair. He thanked everyone for coming and started talking about the community center. My breath caught slightly. I knew this was it. My sisters leaned forward, eager to hear themselves mentioned. But the pastor smiled at me instead. I stayed perfectly still, the key pressing against my palm. This was the moment I had spent years earning in silence. Soon, the entire family would know the truth. The quiet one at the kids' table had just changed everything. The pastor spoke about faith and community, his voice carrying through the hall with that calm strength people trusted. He mentioned how the community center nearly shut down earlier this year, and how help came from an unexpected place. My sisters looked confused. They whispered to each other, trying to guess which business donated. I kept my head down, stirring the ice in my tea. The sound of it clinking against the glass kept me steady. I knew every word he said was leading to me, but I didn't rush it. I wanted them to hear it properly. Evelyn leaned over to her husband and whispered that she told Pastor Brown to ask the city for money. He nodded proudly, thinking it might be them. I could tell by their smiles, they already decided the credit was theirs. I didn't even look up. I wanted to see how far they'd carry their fantasy before it collapsed. The kids were restless again, passing rolls to each other. I quietly fixed a plate for one of them and handed it over. Keeping my hands busy helped me stay calm. The truth was already walking toward them, one word at a time. The pastor talked about the center's history, how it was built by our grandparents, how it became the heart of the town. His words painted a picture of what would have been lost without help. People were nodding, agreeing, feeling proud of their connection to it. I wanted to remind them that pride doesn't pay bills. That roof didn't fix itself. I remembered the day I signed the papers, the long line at the bank, the look on the teller's face when I handed over my last check. That moment was burned into me. It had felt both terrifying and right. Evelyn's daughter pulled out her phone to record the pastor's speech. She probably thought it'd be good for social media. Everyone loved showing off their charity, even when it wasn't theirs. I sat still, watching crumbs fall from plates to the tablecloth. The children were starting to yawn, sugar crashing from all the desserts. Across the room, I caught the pastor's wife giving me a small smile, one that said, "It's almost time." I nodded back faintly. My throat felt dry, but not from fear, just from waiting too long for this moment to arrive. The pastor started to thank specific families for their donations. He mentioned Evelyn and her husband first. They both waved proudly. Then he named 2 other cousins who gave smaller amounts. Everyone clapped politely. My hands stayed still. I wasn't ungrateful. I just knew something deeper was coming. The pastor paused for a second longer than usual, flipping his papers, like he wanted to make sure he got it right. He said there was one more person who deserved special recognition. A hush spread across the room. I took a slow breath, feeling the key in my pocket again. He spoke about someone who had always been there for others, who never asked for attention or thanks. I looked down at the table, pretending to adjust my napkin. Evelyn rolled her eyes, whispering that he must be talking about one of the deacons. But I saw her husband straighten a little, ready to accept the praise if it came his way. Everyone loves being called humble until they're asked to prove it. I smiled slightly to myself, remembering all the times they forgot me in rooms just like this. Tonight, they couldn't ignore me even if they tried. Before the pastor could reveal the name, Evelyn cut in loudly, laughing that it must have been her husband who saved the center. The crowd chuckled. The pastor smiled politely and said he wasn't done. The air in the room changed. Conversations dropped off one by one. I felt the tiniest tremble in my hands, but folded them under the table. He looked directly at me then, his words deliberate and clear. He said the donor was someone sitting quietly among them, someone who had given more than anyone could imagine, both money and heart. That silence afterward felt enormous. When the pastor said my name, for a split second I thought I misheard him. The sound of it bounced off the walls, clear and certain. Every head turned. Forks froze midair. Evelyn blinked fast, her lips parting like the word itself didn't make sense. I felt every eye on me, sharp and confused. The pastor continued talking, but I barely caught the rest. My own name echoed in my head like a drumbeat. I didn't move, didn't smile, didn't stand. I just sat there, letting them stare. I'd waited half a lifetime for this exact kind of silence. People started murmuring, asking if he was serious. The pastor nodded, lifting the framed certificate in his hand. It had my name engraved on it. I had signed the check that saved the center, and now they all knew it. I finally stood up, my knees steady. The kids clapped first, unsure what else to do. A few adults followed. Some looked embarrassed, others amazed. Evelyn stared like she was trying to remember if she'd missed a part of my life. The pastor motioned for me to come forward, and every step I took felt like walking into sunlight. I reached the podium, and the pastor handed me the plaque, My fingers brushed against the engraved letters, and for the first time in my life, my name looked powerful, not attached to someone else's work, not listed under helping hands, but standing alone. The pastor thanked me, saying I'd given enough to keep the center open for 5 more years. The crowd clapped louder this time. I looked over the tables and saw faces shifting between guilt and pride. I smiled, not out of revenge, but because I finally felt seen. I didn't need anything else from them. Evelyn forced a laugh and said it must have been extra church money I had lying around. She tried to make it sound playful, but her tone carried the edge of disbelief. I just turned toward her calmly. I didn't need to defend myself. The pastor explained how I'd donated through my husband's life insurance, how I'd asked for it to stay anonymous until the community center's renovation was complete. The room went quiet again. Evelyn lowered her eyes. It wasn't pity I saw in their faces now. It was something else, realization. The kind that changes how people look at you. As the applause started again, I thought about all the nights I'd worked 2 jobs to make that check possible. I remembered the overtime shifts, the quiet dinners alone, the long walks home from the bus stop with aching feet. Every dollar meant something to me, and now that meaning was written in gold on that plaque. The applause faded into background noise. I saw tears in a few eyes across the room. I stood taller. For once, my back didn't feel heavy from bending over for others. The moment was bigger than pride. It was peace finally arriving. After the pastor finished speaking, people began approaching me one by one. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years offered hugs and praise. It felt strange. These were the same people who used to forget my birthday. Still, I accepted their kindness. There was no anger left in me. The kids gathered around my chair, asking questions about the center, wondering if they could visit. I promised to show them the kitchen I helped rebuild. It felt right to share it with them. Maybe that's how change really starts, when one small truth finally gets spoken out loud. Dinner carried on, but it was quieter now. The laughter had softened, replaced by awkward glances and half smiles. I didn't mind. I sat back at my place, the plaque resting beside my plate. The macaroni and cheese was cold, but I didn't care. Across the room, Evelyn whispered to her husband again, probably trying to spin the story to save face. I let her. People always rewrite what embarrasses them. I had no need to correct anyone anymore. I'd said nothing, and still managed to say everything that needed to be said. That kind of silence was satisfying. The pastor returned to his seat, giving me a reassuring nod. He looked proud, not of the money, but of what it represented, someone ordinary doing something extraordinary. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a window. I looked calm, even graceful, the kind of calm that comes when the weight finally slides off your shoulders. Someone nearby murmured that they never realized I had that kind of money. Another said they should have treated me better. I didn't react. I wasn't looking for apologies. I was looking for peace, and for the first time in years, I had it. Before we continue and see how the night unfolds, take a moment to support stories like this one. Leave a like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. It truly helps me share more moments that matter. Evelyn's husband stood up and clapped loudly, trying to act proud of me. His gesture felt forced, like he was making up for lost time. I thanked him anyway. The pastor asked me to say a few words, and I simply said I was grateful. That was all. No speech, no story, just gratitude. The fewer words, the stronger they felt. My voice didn't shake, and that surprised me. For the first time, I didn't feel small or overlooked. Every person in that hall had to look right at me, and that was more than enough reward for any lifetime. As the evening went on, people started cleaning up the tables. I helped too, out of habit. A cousin stopped me, saying I shouldn't be lifting dishes after what I'd done. I smiled and told her helping was part of who I was. I didn't mind. Some habits were born from love, not obligation. I carried a stack of plates toward the kitchen, passing Evelyn on the way. She avoided my eyes, pretending to rearrange serving spoons. It didn't bother me. I knew her pride hurt, but pain often teaches what kindness cannot. She'd understand someday. Maybe. Inside the kitchen, I rinsed dishes quietly. The sound of running water helped drown the noise from the hall. I saw my reflection again in the window above the sink. This time, my face looked lighter, softer, as if someone had turned down the years sitting on my shoulders. My hands worked without thought, just like they always had, but now they worked for peace instead of approval. I could hear faint laughter outside again. Life was returning to normal. That was fine. What mattered was that my place in it had changed forever. No one could erase that. When I came back out, the tables were half empty. Some people had already left, giving polite waves on their way out. A few lingered, pretending to clean, but really just wanting another look at me. Evelyn sat stiffly, scrolling on her phone. Her daughter leaned close to her, whispering something, then both looked at me. I met their eyes and smiled kindly. There was no need to feed whatever story they were writing. I turned away and picked up another stack of plates. I had nothing to prove now, and that feeling was the sweetest kind of freedom. The pastor came over with a kind smile and said, "You did good, Marjorie." He didn't need to say more. His voice held the weight of understanding. I told him thank you, and he nodded before turning back to his wife. Watching them together made me think about my late husband again, the quiet man who always believed I had more to give. I missed him tonight. I like to think he'd be proud if he could see me now. Maybe he had seen it all somehow, from wherever peace finds people like him. I hoped so. I sat back down at the kids' table once the cleanup finished. The room looked different now, less like a gathering I served, more like a place I belonged in. A few children climbed back into their chairs, chewing leftover rolls. One of them handed me a paper napkin folded into a flower. I smiled and kept it. Simple gestures had always meant the most to me. I rested my hands on the table, listening to the quiet hum of people talking softly. It wasn't the kind of celebration you could see, but I could feel it settling around me. Someone near the back started playing an old gospel tune on a portable speaker. The music filled the space, gentle and familiar. I watched Evelyn's husband tap his foot awkwardly, trying to look cheerful again. She stayed still, avoiding everyone's eyes. I wasn't angry anymore, not even a little. You can't carry peace and bitterness in the same hand. I took a sip of sweet tea, cool and smooth, and realized I was finally free of needing their approval. That freedom tasted better than anything I'd cooked tonight. I wanted to remember it forever. A young cousin came up to me, holding her phone, asking if she could post my picture with the pastor. I said yes. If it inspired someone, that was fine. She asked how it felt to be the hero. I laughed softly and told her there were no heroes here, just people doing what's right when no one's looking. She nodded thoughtfully and hugged me before running off. Watching her go made me think about how much I used to dream of being noticed. Now I realized the best recognition was the one that didn't need to be chased. Evelyn finally approached me, her expression caught somewhere between pride and discomfort. She said I surprised her, that she didn't know I had it in me. I thanked her politely. No sarcasm, no bite. She hesitated before saying she wished she'd done something similar. I told her there was always time to do something good. That was all I said. Her eyes softened a little before she turned away. It wasn't forgiveness or closeness, but it was something new, a small step toward respect. Sometimes, that's all a family like ours can manage, and that's enough. As the night grew late, people started stacking chairs, wiping tables, and collecting leftover food. The pastor thanked everyone again and said a closing prayer. When he mentioned gratitude, his eyes met mine. I smiled back. My body ached, but my spirit felt strong. I took one last look around the hall. The same walls, the same people, yet somehow everything had changed. I picked up the plaque and the little napkin flower the child had given me. Together they felt like proof of a life finally noticed. I whispered a quiet thank you to the emptying room. When the last of the kids left the room, I helped the pastor's wife gather the donation boxes. She thanked me softly, saying the community owed me more than they could ever repay. I told her I didn't do it for repayment. I just didn't want to see something built by our grandparents turn into dust. She nodded. understanding. The room was nearly empty now, but the echoes of laughter still floated through the air. I stood near the doorway, watching everyone leave, realizing how strange it felt to finally have done something that couldn't be taken away. Outside, the night air was cool. Cars lined up, headlights flashing across the gravel. I could hear my cousins shouting goodbyes and honking as they left. I stayed by the doorway, holding the plaque close to my chest. For years, I had walked home from gatherings like this, feeling invisible. Not tonight. Tonight, my steps felt grounded, sure of where they were heading. I didn't have to prove anything anymore. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I walked toward my car, the key in my pocket, tapping softly like a quiet reminder that my story had finally changed. Driving home, I passed the community center. Its lights were still on, glowing faintly through the windows. The new sign out front looked clean and proud, the paint still fresh. I pulled over for a moment, just to look at it. My name wasn't on that sign, but my heart was in every brick. I thought about how many lives would walk through those doors and never know who made it possible. That thought didn't bother me anymore. The world didn't have to know my name. I just wanted to leave behind something worth keeping. That was enough. Back home, the house greeted me with quiet warmth. I set the plaque down on the kitchen table and turned on one small lamp. The glow landed on the family photos lined up along the wall. So many faces, so many years of work, and memories I didn't know how to feel about yet. I sat down and unwrapped the key from its ribbon. My husband had given me that ribbon before he passed, saying one day I'd use it for something good. I smiled, realizing he'd been right. It had taken me years to believe him. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned back in the chair. My feet ached, but my heart was steady. I remembered every insult, every moment they brushed me off like I was nobody. Somehow, it didn't sting anymore. I had learned something bigger than pride. Quiet strength lasts longer than applause. I sipped my water, looking at the clock. It was just past midnight. Somewhere out there, the pastor was probably locking the doors to the center. I imagined him doing it carefully, not knowing how much of my soul was tied to those locks and windows. I walked to the window and opened it slightly. The night smelled like rain on hot asphalt. The sound of it dripping from the trees was gentle, steady. It reminded me of childhood evenings spent watching storms roll through, when my mother told me that good things grow after rain. I believed her again tonight. I took a deep breath and felt a strange calm wash through me. The house creaked a little, the way old houses do when they settle. For the first time, it didn't feel lonely. It felt full, like the quiet was keeping me company. I found myself thinking about that broken promise I once made, to live for myself. For years I pushed it aside because family came first. Every meal, every chore, every sacrifice chipped away at me, piece by piece. But giving to the community center had changed that promise into something real. I didn't break it. I just redefined it. Living for myself didn't mean turning away from others. It meant building something that mattered beyond me. I smiled at the thought, realizing how different the meaning of family looked when you stopped waiting for their approval. It finally made sense. I took the folded letter out of my purse and opened it carefully. The paper was creased from being carried so long. It was the letter from the city's committee confirming the donation under my name, dated months ago. I ran my fingers over the printed words, remembering how nervous I'd been signing that check. Back then, I wasn't sure if it was the right decision. Tonight, there wasn't a doubt left in me. That paper represented the part of me they never saw. The woman who made hard choices quietly, without needing anyone's permission or recognition. I placed the letter beside the plaque and turned off the light in the kitchen. The darkness didn't feel empty anymore. As I climbed the stairs, I thought about the sound of that distant church bell earlier in the evening. It had rung right before the pastor said my name, almost like a signal. I like to believe some things line up in ways we can't explain. Maybe the bell wasn't just coincidence. Maybe it was life reminding me that being overlooked doesn't mean unseen. I carried that thought with me up each step, feeling lighter than I had in years. In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off my shoes. My toes ached, but I didn't care. I looked around at the familiar walls, the same ones that once felt like a cage. Now, they felt like protection. The world outside had finally shifted in a way that let me breathe. I leaned back on the bed and closed my eyes, picturing the faces from tonight, the confusion, the surprise, the small sparks of respect. It wasn't about revenge or pride, it was about being seen, finally, without having to demand it. That was peace. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains. I woke earlier than usual, still wearing last night's dress. I smiled to myself and stretched, hearing the faint hum of birds outside. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from the pastor, thanking me again and asking if I could attend the dedication tomorrow. I typed back, "Of course." Then I set the phone down and looked at my reflection in the mirror. I looked the same, yet everything about me felt different. Recognition didn't change me. It reminded me I'd been enough all along. I made coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The street was quiet, lined with wet leaves from the night's rain. Across the road, Mrs. Carter waved from her garden. I waved back. I'd helped her with groceries last week, and now she smiled at me like she always did. It was comforting, knowing some things didn't have to change. I took a sip of coffee and thought about the children who'd cheered for me last night. Maybe one day they'd remember that moment and think differently about kindness, that it's not weakness, but strength that doesn't need applause. After breakfast, I went to the spare room where I kept old boxes. Dust floated in the sunlight, coming through the window. I opened one labeled Family Reunions and found old photos, folded programs, and postcards that were never mailed. Each photo showed me standing near the back, half hidden behind someone taller. I smiled, shaking my head. That woman felt like a stranger now. I picked one picture from 1999, where I was carrying 2 trays of food. I decided to frame it beside the plaque. It felt right to keep both, the silent years and the recognition together. Later that afternoon, I drove to the community center again. Construction workers were finishing the paint job on the new kitchen walls. The smell of fresh paint mixed with sawdust. I walked through the hallway slowly, tracing my fingers along the clean surface. The space looked alive again. A few volunteers smiled and waved when they saw me. They knew who I was now, and their warmth felt genuine. I didn't stay long. I just wanted to see it with my own eyes, to make sure what I'd built wasn't a dream. It was real, every bit of it. As I left the building, I passed by the bulletin board. A flyer caught my attention. It was for the grand reopening ceremony. My name wasn't printed anywhere on it, and that made me smile. It reminded me that I didn't need a title or label for the work to matter. The flyer listed the pastor as the speaker, but I knew he'd mention me again, and that was enough. I folded one of the flyers and tucked it into my purse. Something about keeping it felt like saving proof that the world could be rebuilt, even quietly. Driving back, I turned on the local radio. The pastor's church service was being replayed. When he mentioned the anonymous donor who'd saved the center, my chest warmed. He didn't use my name this time, but his words carried the same weight. "Sometimes the quietest people do the loudest good," he said. I pulled over, just to listen. The words washed over me, like a gentle tide. Maybe that was all I ever wanted, to know that silence could be powerful when it came from the right place. I closed my eyes, smiling to the sound of his calm voice. That evening, Evelyn called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was softer than usual. She said she wanted to apologize if she ever made me feel less than the rest. I could hear her pride fighting to stay alive behind those words. I told her it was all right. Families have their ways, and we learn from them. She hesitated, then asked if she could visit tomorrow before the dedication. I said yes. There was no anger left to hold on to. Sometimes letting go of the grudge feels better than winning. I spent the rest of the night cleaning, humming to myself as I worked. Old habits felt comforting when done by choice. I polished the picture frame and placed it beside the plaque on the table. Together they told a story of quiet persistence. I lit a candle beside them, the same one I used to light for my husband on his birthdays. The flame burned steady, barely moving. I whispered that we'd finally done it. The light reflected off the glass frame, casting soft shapes on the wall. The house felt warmer than it had in years. Before bed, I sat by the window again. The moonlight spread across the street like a silver path. I thought about tomorrow's ceremony, imagining the music, the speeches, the faces of the children walking into their new space. I wondered if anyone would remember this moment years from now. Maybe they would. Maybe not. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I'd left something behind that would outlive me. I smiled quietly, touched the key still on my nightstand, and felt peace settle deep in my chest like it finally belonged there. Sleep came easy that night. My dreams were light and kind. I dreamed of sitting at a long table again, but this time there was no kids' table, no laughter at my expense. Everyone sat together, sharing stories, passing food, smiling without judgment. It was simple but beautiful. I woke with that image still in my mind. For the first time in a long time, I didn't wake with worry or noise in my head. The silence was soft, almost healing. Maybe that's what acceptance really sounds like, quiet, but full of meaning. The next morning, I dressed in a cream-colored suit, the one I'd kept for special occasions. It wasn't new, but it still fit well. I looked in the mirror and felt something close to pride. Not pride in how I looked, but in how far I'd come. I picked up the key and tucked it back into my pocket. It felt right keeping it close. It had started as a symbol of hope and now felt like proof of purpose. I locked the door behind me and stepped outside into sunlight that seemed brighter than usual. At the community center, people were already gathering. Balloons tied to the gate swayed in the breeze. Children ran around the playground, while adults chatted near the entrance. The pastor saw me and waved. He looked relieved that I came. I smiled and nodded. Evelyn was there too, standing off to the side in a bright blue dress. She caught my eye and gave a small nod. It wasn't a full apology, but it was something. I walked toward the steps, the sound of the church bell ringing softly somewhere in the distance again. It felt like a blessing. During the ceremony, the pastor spoke again about community and family. He thanked everyone who helped, and then asked me to come forward to cut the ribbon. I didn't expect that. The crowd clapped, cheering louder than before. I took the scissors from his hand, cutting through the red ribbon with a quick snip. The children cheered and rushed inside, their laughter filling the air. I stood back, watching them explore the new space. It hit me then. Everything I'd worked for wasn't about me at all. It was about them, their joy, their future. That realization felt pure. Evelyn came over quietly as people explored the building. She looked unsure but sincere. She said she wanted to volunteer at the center, maybe teach cooking classes. I smiled and told her they'd be lucky to have her. Her eyes softened, and she nodded, maybe realizing that giving felt better than boasting. We stood side by side for a while, watching the children laugh and run. It felt peaceful, like the air between us had cleared. For the first time in years, I felt like we were sisters again, not rivals, not comparisons, just family. When the crowd thinned out, I stayed behind, walking through the new kitchen. Everything shined, steel counters, clean tiles, shelves full of fresh supplies. I placed my hand on the countertop and closed my eyes, imagining all the meals that would be made here. This space wasn't just a kitchen anymore. It was proof that ordinary hands could build something lasting. I turned toward the door, hearing the pastor call my name. He wanted a photo of me, holding the key. I smiled and raised it, the ribbon catching the light. It felt like life itself was smiling back. The pastor thanked everyone again before ending the ceremony. People drifted out in small groups, chatting about the food and how nice the new place looked. I stayed behind, walking slowly through the hall one last time. The echo of laughter lingered in the corners. The polished floors reflected sunlight, and the air smelled faintly of new paint. I thought about how strange it felt to build something so alive from a place that once held nothing but loss. The memory of my husband came to mind again, and I whispered that we finally did it. Outside, the sky had turned a pale blue, the kind that makes you want to breathe deeper. I stood by the entrance, watching families take pictures near the new sign. A small boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing at me. She smiled and brought him over to thank me. He handed me a tiny drawing of the building he had made in crayon. I bent down, took it carefully, and promised to keep it safe. It wasn't about the building anymore. It was about the future these kids would have, because one person decided not to stay silent. Evelyn waved goodbye from her car window, calling out that she'd see me next Sunday. I waved back, feeling something softer between us, something that might turn into closeness again, if we both let it. The pastor came up beside me, holding his hat against the wind. He said, I should be proud of myself. I told him I was more grateful than proud. He nodded and said gratitude lasts longer anyway. We both laughed lightly. Then he thanked me again and left. I stayed there a moment longer, staring at the building before finally turning toward home. Driving home, I felt calm in a way I hadn't in years. No guilt, no frustration, just calm. I realized that for so long, I had measured my worth through the eyes of others, through how much I gave or how well I served. But now, I knew that giving didn't make me small, it made me whole. I rolled down the window, letting the wind brush my face. Somewhere behind me, the church bell rang again, faint but clear. It didn't sound like goodbye this time. It sounded like acknowledgement, like the world itself was finally nodding back. When I pulled into my driveway, the sun was just beginning to dip. I sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the quiet street. My house looked different now, not because it had changed, but because I used to see it as a cage of routine. But tonight, it looked like a place built by endurance. I turned off the engine and listened to the tick of cooling metal. Each click sounded like a heartbeat, reminding me I was still here, still building, still capable of surprising even myself. That thought felt good. Inside, I placed the child's drawing beside the plaque. The little building in crayon looked nothing like the real thing, but it held more meaning than any photograph ever could. I lit the candle again and watched its glow spread across the table. The flame flickered slightly, bending toward the picture, almost like it recognized it. I sat down and poured a cup of tea, the kind my mother used to make on calm nights. It felt like a quiet ritual, one last moment to take everything in before life slipped back into its usual rhythm. Later that evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The neighborhood was quiet, except for a few dogs barking down the street. I watched the sky shift from orange to gray, then to deep blue. The air smelled like someone's barbecue, a few houses over. I smiled, thinking about how simple moments like this often carry more peace than big ones. The world had changed, just enough for me to notice the difference. I didn't need attention. I didn't need praise. I just needed to sit here and feel free for once. As I rocked gently in my chair, I thought about all the versions of myself I had lived through, the young woman who tried too hard, the middle-aged aunt who gave too much, and now this one, finally balanced. Each version had its place. Each carried lessons the next needed. I realized growth doesn't happen in big leaps. It happens quietly in moments like this, when you finally stop apologizing for taking up space. I closed my eyes for a while, listening to the faint hum of the streetlights, feeling more grounded than I ever had before. The phone rang inside, breaking the stillness. I went to answer it and found it was my cousin Janine. She said the family was still talking about last night, that some were embarrassed, others inspired. She laughed lightly and told me Evelyn couldn't stop saying she'd underestimated me. I laughed too, not to mock but because it felt strange to hear. Janine said she wished she had my patience. I told her it wasn't patience. It was purpose. Patience waits for something. Purpose creates it. There was a long pause before she said that made more sense than anything else. After the call, I sat by the window again. The streetlights glowed against the wet pavement. A neighbor walked by with his dog, and we waved at each other. I thought about how many quiet lives pass by every day, each one carrying stories that never get told. Maybe that's what makes kindness so powerful. It happens without an audience. I decided right then to write down everything I'd been through, not for fame, but so someone else could read it someday and feel less invisible. Sometimes, stories are the only bridges between silence and understanding. The next morning, I went to the community center early to help set up for the first children's workshop. The smell of breakfast filled the air, and the sound of laughter echoed down the hallway. It felt alive already. I helped lay out art supplies on the tables and made sure the little aprons were clean. A volunteer thanked me again, and I smiled. I didn't tell her who I was. I just said I was happy to help. That's the kind of freedom I loved most. Doing something meaningful without needing to remind anyone of what I'd done before. One little girl ran up to me, holding a paper crown, asking if I could fix the tape. I knelt down and helped her press it back together. She grinned and placed it on my head, saying I was the queen of helpers. I laughed, adjusting it slightly. If she only knew how far that word helper had come for me, from being a label that kept me small to something that now made me proud. I wore that paper crown for the rest of the morning, letting it sit crooked and light, like a crown of peace instead of burden. By noon, the room was full of laughter, paint stains, and half-finished art projects. I watched the children creating shapes and colors without hesitation. One boy asked what I was making, and I told him I was making a memory. He didn't understand, but he smiled anyway. That's when I realized this was what I had wanted all along, not recognition, but continuation. These kids were carrying forward what my grandparents started. I could almost see their faces in my mind, proud and patient. The idea of legacy finally made sense. It wasn't about being remembered, it was about impact. After lunch, I stepped outside to breathe. The smell of paint and pancakes mixed oddly in the air, but it made me smile. Evelyn arrived a little late, holding a tray of cookies. She waved and came over, handing them to me. I thanked her and told her the children would love them. She said she was serious about volunteering, and I told her that made me happy. We stood there quietly for a while, watching a group of kids chase a ball across the yard. For once, our silence wasn't awkward. It felt like understanding. Evelyn confessed she had felt jealous of me last night, but not because of the donation. She said she realized she'd spent her life chasing approval, too. I nodded, telling her that chasing it never ends. It just changes faces. She said she didn't know how I stayed kind. Through all of it, I told her kindness was easier than anger. Once you stop expecting anything back. She smiled weakly, saying she hoped to learn that too. Maybe she would. We hugged before going back inside, and I could tell something between us had shifted for good this time. That evening, I returned home, tired but content. I placed the cookies. Evelyn had left me on the counter and poured a glass of milk. I ate one, smiling at the sweetness. The house was quiet again, but not empty. I thought about how full my days felt now, not because they were busy, but because they were meaningful. I walked around tidying up, humming an old tune my mother used to sing when she cooked. Her voice came back to me like an echo from another time. Somehow, it made everything feel connected again. Later, as the sun set, I went through my closet and found an old box labeled Letters. Inside were postcards I'd written years ago but never sent. Some were to friends who'd moved away, others to family members I hadn't spoken to in decades. I read one addressed to my father, written after he passed. It said, "I'm still trying to make you proud." I smiled faintly, folded it back in, and closed the box. I didn't need to send them anymore. The life I was living now said everything those letters ever could. That realization was enough. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the living room, the candle flickering on the table again. I stared at the flame and thought about the meaning of patience. People always said it was waiting quietly, but I disagreed. Patience was working quietly. It was planting seeds and trusting the soil to remember you. I realized that's what I'd been doing all my life. Even when nobody saw it, I'd been planting something, and now watching that flame glow steady, I knew the harvest had finally arrived. My work had always been worth it. I glanced at the clock and noticed it was nearing midnight. The house ticked softly, the sound blending with the distant hum of the town. The same watch I'd seen my nephew showing off flashed in my mind, the one that ticked only at midnight. I wondered if he'd notice it tonight and think about this day. Maybe he'd grow up understanding that real worth doesn't come from noise or attention. It comes from how deeply you care. I smiled at the thought, knowing the lesson had already started passing through generations, one quiet act at a time. The next day, I returned to the center again, this time to meet the new volunteers. Some were familiar faces from church, others from nearby neighborhoods. They greeted me warmly, calling me Miss Marjorie. I helped them organize supplies and listen to their plans for future programs. Hearing their excitement filled me with joy. The place already felt alive, like it had a heartbeat of its own. I realized then that I didn't have to lead everything. I just had to trust what I'd started. Letting go was its own kind of faith, and I had plenty now. At lunch, a young woman from the local paper came to interview the pastor. When she spotted me, she asked if she could take my picture for the story. I hesitated, but said yes. She asked me to hold the plaque, and I did. The flash went off, bright, but brief. I wondered how it would feel seeing my face in the newspaper. For a second, I felt shy, but then proud. Maybe someone else would read the article and realize that quiet people have stories worth telling too. Maybe it would remind them not to overlook the silent ones. After the reporter left, I sat in the empty hall, the smell of fresh coffee lingering in the air. I looked around at the chairs stacked neatly in the corner and thought about the years I'd spent stacking chairs for others. It used to feel like servitude, but now it felt like contribution. The act hadn't changed. I had. Perspective turns repetition into meaning. I smiled at that thought, brushing crumbs off the table, knowing the lesson would outlast me. Some lessons don't need to be preached. They just need to be lived. Evelyn walked in, holding a folder filled with recipe sheets. She said she was preparing for her first class next week. I helped her organize them, laughing at how serious she looked. She said she hadn't felt excited about something in years. I told her maybe excitement was contagious. She smiled, and for once, I saw the same spark in her that I used to envy. It wasn't competition anymore. It was growth. Watching her fill that role made me realize that when you share light, it doesn't dim yours. It doubles it. That truth felt beautiful and simple. By late afternoon, the building was quiet again. I walked to the doorway and looked outside. The children's drawings were still taped to the windows, bright and uneven but full of heart. I saw mine among them, the one the boy had given me. I smiled, thinking how fitting it was that it now hung here for everyone to see. That drawing had become part of the place it celebrated. I whispered a soft prayer of thanks and promised myself to keep showing up for this place, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. As I locked the door behind me, I caught sight of the sunset reflecting off the windows. The light painted the building in gold and orange, glowing like it was alive. I stood there for a while, holding the key in my hand, feeling its weight. It was the same key I had once carried in secret, afraid to show anyone. Now it felt like a symbol of belonging. I slipped it back into my pocket, knowing it didn't just open a door anymore, it opened a new chapter of who I had finally become. That night, I placed the key and plaque together on my kitchen table again. The candle burned nearby, its glow steady and calm. I stared at the two objects, realizing how much of my story they held. The key represented everything I kept hidden, and the plaque represented what I finally allowed the world to see. Between them sat years of quiet work, pain, and patience. I didn't feel proud in a loud way. It was quieter, deeper, almost sacred. Some victories don't make noise. They just breathe inside you, reminding you that your purpose was never wasted. I decided to write a letter that night. Not to anyone in particular, just a letter to myself. I wrote about the dinner, the laughter, the moment the pastor said my name. I described the faces of my family, their confusion turning to realization. Then I wrote about what I learned, that being overlooked isn't the same as being forgotten. I folded the letter neatly and tucked it into my diary. There were pages filled with doubts and old disappointments, but this one felt different. It was proof that patience, when guided by purpose, eventually finds its way home. In the morning, I woke early again and went to the community center. The smell of fresh bread greeted me before I even stepped inside. Evelyn was already there, baking with a few volunteers. She looked genuinely happy, laughing as flour dusted her sleeves. Seeing her like that made me smile. She offered me a roll straight from the oven, warm and soft. I took a bite, nodding in approval. She grinned like a child. It was simple, but it felt like healing. Two sisters finally meeting halfway after years of standing on opposite ends of pride and misunderstanding. The pastor walked in with his usual smile, carrying boxes of donated books. He thanked us for being there and said he was proud of how much the center had already grown. He handed me a stack of books to sort through. As I placed them on the shelves, I noticed one was a Bible with a note tucked inside. It read, "To the quiet builders, may your work last beyond your name." My eyes softened. I didn't know who wrote it, but it felt like it was meant for me. I slipped the note into my pocket and smiled. Later that afternoon, the pastor asked if I would speak at Sunday's service about what inspired my donation. The thought made me nervous. I had never been comfortable speaking in front of people. I told him I'd think about it. On my walk home, I kept wondering what I'd even say. How do you explain years of silence turning into strength? How do you describe what it means to carry love that nobody notices? I realized I didn't need fancy words. Maybe all I needed to say was that kindness has power even when nobody claps for it. That evening, I sat on my porch again, watching the street as children played tag near the corner. Their laughter floated up through the warm air. I remembered being their age, dreaming of doing something important one day. Back then, I thought importance meant being known. Now I understood. It meant being useful, being needed, making life better for others in small ways. I took a sip of my tea and felt a quiet happiness settle in. The world hadn't changed overnight, but I had. That was enough to make everything around me feel new again. I spent Saturday baking pies for Sunday's service, humming softly as I worked. My kitchen smelled like cinnamon and butter, the kind of smell that feels like home. I found myself thinking about my mother again, remembering how she used to say, "Every meal you make is a piece of love someone can taste." I used to think she meant cooking, but now I knew she was talking about life. Everything we do for others is a form of love. Some people taste it right away, others take years to recognize it. Either way, it never goes to waste. Sunday came, and I wore a pale yellow dress that had been hanging untouched for years. When I arrived at church, the pews were already full. Evelyn waved me over to sit beside her. The pastor began the service, his voice warm and full of gratitude. When he called my name to speak, my heart fluttered, but I stood. The microphone felt heavy in my hand. I looked around at faces that had once looked right through me. Now, they were waiting to listen. It was a moment I didn't need to rush. I let the silence settle first. I spoke simply. I told them I wasn't there to inspire or impress anyone. I said I'd spent my life believing kindness had to be loud to count, but I was wrong. Quiet giving carries its own kind of music. I told them, you just have to listen for it. I shared how the community center reminded me that service isn't about who notices, it's about what survives. When I finished, there were no cheers, no standing ovation, just stillness, deep and full. The kind that means something real has landed where it needed to. That was enough. After service, people came up to thank me. Some looked emotional, others thoughtful. One woman said my words reminded her of her grandmother. That meant more to me than anything. Evelyn hugged me again before we left. The pastor shook my hand and said, "You taught us something today." I smiled and told him they had taught me too. Walking out of that church felt like walking through a doorway into the rest of my life. Not new exactly, just finally mine. Every step felt like the echo of the truth I'd finally learned to stand on. Later that day, I stopped by the cemetery where my husband was buried. The grass was neatly cut, and the sky hung low and calm. I placed a single daisy on his grave, something simple. I told him about everything. The dinner, the plaque, the center, Evelyn. Saying it out loud made it all feel more real. I thanked him for believing in me when no one else did. For years, I carried that belief like a secret. Now, I was ready to live it out loud. I stood there a while, letting the peace sink in around me. Before leaving, I took out the note I found in the Bible and placed it on the grave. To the quiet builders, it said, "That felt like us. We both built quietly, him with his faith, me with my persistence." I whispered goodbye and walked back to the car, feeling lighter. The wind picked up just then, and the daisy I'd left bent slightly, as if bowing. I smiled, taking it as a small sign. Love doesn't disappear when someone dies. It just changes form, following you wherever you finally start to bloom. That thought comforted me deeply. When I got home, the phone was ringing again. This time it was a woman from the local school board. She said she heard about the community center's success and wanted to start a similar program for students. She asked if I'd consider helping. I told her I'd be honored. Hanging up, I laughed softly to myself. Life had a way of finding you when you least expected it. I'd spent years waiting for recognition, and now I was being asked to share what I knew. It felt like purpose had decided to chase me for a change. That evening, I sat outside again, looking up at the stars. They seemed brighter than usual. Maybe because I finally had time to notice them. I thought about all the years I spent doing everything for everyone else, and how little I gave myself credit for surviving it all. I realized surviving with your heart intact is its own kind of achievement. You don't get trophies for it, but you earn something better. Peace. The night breeze brushed my skin gently, and I closed my eyes, letting it remind me that contentment doesn't need applause to be real. Evelyn called again, this time just to talk. No apologies, no hidden motives, just conversation. She asked what I was cooking for dinner, and I told her chicken and rice. She laughed and said she'd come by if I saved her a plate. I told her she didn't need an invitation. We hung up, and I stood there for a moment, smiling at how easy it sounded. That small exchange meant more than years of family dinners ever had. Sometimes reconciliation doesn't come through big speeches. It slips in through small talk and shared meals. That's how hearts heal. When she arrived, I had already set the table for two. We ate quietly at first, then started sharing stories from our childhood, things we hadn't talked about in decades. We laughed until our sides hurt. She said she missed this, and I told her I did too. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel too big or too quiet. It felt like home again. After dinner, we washed dishes together, side by side, the way we used to when we were girls helping Mama after Sunday meals. It felt like something sacred had returned. As she left, Evelyn hugged me tightly and thanked me for forgiving her. I told her there was nothing to forgive. We had both done what we knew at the time. She nodded and said she hoped to be more like me one day. I told her she already was. Her eyes softened before she left, and I stood at the doorway watching her car pull away. The streetlights glowed across the pavement, and for once, I didn't feel the usual ache when people left. I felt full, as if love had finally found its way back home. The next few days passed quietly. I spent my mornings volunteering and my evenings journaling. I wanted to capture everything before it faded into memory. Writing it down felt like talking to someone who understood. The pages filled up faster than I expected. Stories of hard lessons, small victories, and quiet realizations. I titled the journal, "For the Next Girl Who Feels Invisible." Maybe one day, someone would find it and know they weren't alone. That thought made me smile. I wasn't writing for praise. I was writing to pass on the light that once felt too heavy to carry. One afternoon, the pastor stopped by with his wife. They brought me a framed photo from the dedication day. It showed me holding the key, smiling under the sunlight. He said they wanted me to have it as a reminder of what I'd started. I thanked them and offered them tea. We talked for a while about plans for the center, ideas for youth programs, and ways to involve more families. The pastor's wife said she hoped I realized how much good I'd done. I told her I did now, not because people told me, but because I could feel it. After they left, I hung the photo beside my plaque. Seeing them together on the wall made me tear up a little. It wasn't sadness. It was gratitude. I traced my fingers along the frame and whispered a small prayer of thanks. For years I thought life had passed me by. I thought being unseen meant being unloved. But now, I understood something deeper. Sometimes love isn't loud or obvious. It hides in small moments, in a shared smile, a helping hand, a word of encouragement. Those small moments are what build a lifetime worth remembering. That night, I opened the window to let in the evening air. The sound of the church bell reached me faintly again. Its slow, steady ring filled the silence of my house. I stood there listening, thinking about how that sound had followed me through every turning point lately. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe it was life's way of saying I was where I needed to be. I didn't try to explain it. I just listened until the ringing faded away, leaving behind a quiet so soft it felt like peace itself had come to visit. I sat back down at the kitchen table and looked around the room. Every corner held a memory, some painful, some precious. But together, they told a complete story. I realized healing doesn't erase the past, it just gives it a new meaning. I could finally look back without bitterness. I could see the girl who wanted to be noticed, the woman who gave too much, and the one sitting here now, strong, calm, fulfilled. They weren't separate people. They were all me. It felt good to finally love every version of myself that had survived to reach this peace. Before heading to bed, I blew out the candle, watching the smoke twist up into the air before disappearing. It reminded me of how everything changes form but never truly ends. Love, kindness, memory, even hope. They all just shift into something else. I touched the key one more time before turning off the light. Its surface was warm from the candle's heat. It had opened so many doors, both real and unseen. I placed it gently on the table and whispered that I was ready for whatever door came next. My voice sounded calm, certain, and free. In bed, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the steady rhythm of my heartbeat. I thought about the community center, the family dinners, the church, the long years of invisibility. None of it felt heavy anymore. It all felt necessary. Every disappointment had shaped the peace I carried now. I closed my eyes and pictured the faces of the children drawing and laughing at the center. Their joy was the reward for everything I'd endured. I didn't need anything more from life, just to keep giving quietly, the way light spreads without ever needing to be thanked. Sleep came easily that night. My dreams were gentle again. I saw myself sitting at a long table, the same one from the reunion, but this time every chair was equal. No kids' table, no separation. Everyone shared food, stories, and laughter. Even Evelyn sat beside me, smiling. The pastor was there too, holding the same key, placing it in the middle of the table. The light in the room was warm, and for once, no one looked through me. They looked toward me. I woke up smiling, realizing the dream wasn't fantasy. It was my life, finally balanced. The next morning, sunlight poured through the curtains like a quiet greeting. I stayed in bed a little longer, letting the warmth cover me. The house was peaceful, still carrying the faint scent of the candle from last night. I thought about the dream again, the table, the key, the laughter, and realized it wasn't just a dream, it was closure. Every version of me had finally come together, sitting at that table in harmony. I didn't need more recognition, or another announcement. The world had already shifted in the one way that mattered. I had learned to see myself. I got dressed and took a slow walk down to the park. The trees were full and green, and children played near the swings. I found a bench near the edge, where the sunlight hit just right. Sitting there, I realized how strange it felt to live without that constant urge to prove something. It felt like freedom mixed with calm. A woman nearby recognized me from the paper and thanked me for what I'd done. I smiled and told her that kindness spreads easiest when no one guards it. She nodded softly before walking away, leaving me smiling. A soft breeze carried the smell of freshly cut grass. I closed my eyes and listened to it move through the leaves. It sounded like whispers of every moment that had brought me here, the laughter, the hurt, the prayers. I thought about how long I had lived waiting for validation from people who were too busy to notice, and how strange it was that once I stopped needing it, it arrived on its own. Maybe that's the way peace works. It doesn't show up when you chase it, only when you stop running and decide to stand still. Back home, I watered the plants lined across my porch. Each one had grown taller than I expected. My husband had started that garden years ago, saying it would teach patience better than any sermon. I smiled, realizing he'd been right about that too. Growth takes time, silence, and steady care. I trimmed the dry leaves and whispered thanks to the soil. Every living thing, I thought, needs someone to believe in it long enough for it to bloom. That's what I had been missing all those years. Not belief from others, but belief in myself. Now I had it. I went inside and started sorting through an old drawer full of papers. I found the receipt for the donation, still folded neatly in its envelope. I almost threw it away, but then I stopped. It wasn't about the money, it was about the meaning behind it. I placed it back inside and tucked it with the framed photo and plaque. They were my reminders that even the quietest life can echo if it's lived with intention. I closed the drawer gently, smiling as I thought of the next person who might open it someday and feel inspired. That afternoon, Evelyn came by again. She brought flowers this time. Sunflowers, my favorite. She said she wanted to thank me properly, not just for helping the community, but for helping her remember who she was before all the noise of success and status. I told her I was proud of her too. We sat on the porch drinking lemonade, talking about everything and nothing, the kind of talk that fills the heart without forcing it. The bond we had rebuilt felt fragile but real, like a new plant breaking through the soil after a long winter. She asked me what it felt like, being recognized after so many years. I told her it felt like breathing again after holding it too long. But I also said the recognition wasn't the real reward. The real gift was finally understanding that love doesn't need witnesses to exist. She nodded thoughtfully, her eyes glossy but kind. We sat there quietly, letting that thought settle between us. It wasn't awkward silence, it was shared peace. The kind that happens when two people finally stop competing and start simply being seen for who they really are. Later, she helped me carry out some old boxes to the shed. While lifting one, she found a pair of shoes that had belonged to our mother. We both stopped, staring at them for a moment. They were worn but clean, still holding their shape after all these years. Evelyn ran her hand over the faded leather and smiled sadly. We decided to keep them, placing them together on the shelf near the door. It felt like we were putting something important back where it belonged, a reminder of where we came from and the footsteps that led us here. After she left, I stayed out on the porch, listening to the faint sound of church bells in the distance again. Their rhythm felt slower this time, more peaceful, like a heartbeat syncing with mine. I looked toward the horizon and whispered a quiet thank you to life, to patience, to time. Every struggle, every dismissal, every ignored moment had brought me here, to this stillness that didn't need applause. The sun lowered behind the trees, painting the sky in orange and pink. I sat there until the light faded, not rushing a single second of it. That night, I opened my diary again. I turned to the page where the last entry ended and wrote one final note. I no longer need to be seen to know I matter. Writing those words made me tear up. It was the simplest truth I'd ever written. I closed the diary and placed it next to the candle on my nightstand. The flame flickered gently, as if nodding in agreement. For the first time in years, my heart felt completely light. I didn't owe the world anything anymore. My story had already found its ending, and its beginning. Before bed, I stepped outside once more. The air was cool and still, carrying the scent of jasmine from a neighbor's yard. The stars were bright enough to make the night glow faintly. I thought about how small I looked under that sky, and how strangely comforting that felt. Being small didn't mean being insignificant. It meant being part of something bigger, something shared. I whispered another quiet prayer for everyone still waiting to be seen, hoping they'd find this kind of peace too. Then I went inside, ready to rest with a heart that finally felt complete. Morning came gentle again. I woke up before sunrise and decided to visit the community center early. The streets were empty, washed clean from the night's dew. When I arrived, the building stood quietly, glowing under the first light of day. I unlocked the door with my key, the metal cool against my palm. Inside, everything was still, just as we had left it. I walked down the hallway, the echo of my steps bouncing softly. It felt like walking through a dream that had solidified into something real, something that would outlive me. In the kitchen, I found a half-finished drawing taped to the wall, the one the children had been working on. It showed smiling faces, a big sun, and the words, "Thank you, Miss Marjorie." I touched the paper gently, running my finger along the bright orange letters. My throat tightened, not from sadness, but from joy too full to hold. I took a picture of it on my phone, before sitting down at one of the tables. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator, steady and comforting. This was what peace sounded like. I made a small pot of coffee and sat there sipping slowly, looking around at the bright space that used to be dull and forgotten. Every wall carried a piece of my story now, not through plaques or pictures, but through purpose. I realized this was how legacy truly worked. It wasn't about fame, or statues, or speeches. It was about the quiet work that kept life moving, even when no one watched. I smiled, feeling my husband's presence again, like he was sitting across from me, proud. The world felt perfectly balanced for the first time. After finishing my coffee, I locked the kitchen and walked outside. The early morning air was crisp and kind. Across the yard, I saw the pastor placing new flowers near the steps. He waved, and I walked over. He said he just wanted to thank me again. Not for the money, but for reminding everyone what faith in action looks like. I told him he didn't need to thank me anymore. He smiled and said maybe not, but he still wanted to. We stood there quietly together, watching the sunrise glow across the roof of the building. He told me they planned to rename the kitchen after my mother as a tribute to the family that had kept this town fed for decades. I was speechless for a moment, then nodded. Tears filled my eyes, but I didn't hide them. It felt right. I thanked him softly, promising to help plan the dedication. He said the sign would be ready by next week. As he walked away, I looked back at the door, picturing my mother's name above it. For the first time, I felt like every sacrifice had found its rightful place. I stayed a little longer, sitting on the steps and watching people begin to arrive. Volunteers, parents, children. The building came alive again with voices and laughter. I loved watching life fill the space I had once walked through alone. A little boy ran up to me, waving his art project. It was another drawing of the center, this one showing the sun, the building, and tiny stick figures holding hands. He said it was our family's house. I laughed softly, patting his shoulder. In a way, he was right. This place belonged to all of us now. When I finally left, I walked home slowly, enjoying every step. The world around me looked simple but perfect, the trees swaying, the sidewalks damp, the sound of birds stretching into the morning. I realized peace isn't something you wait to find. It's something you build, piece by piece, moment by moment. Every act of patience, every time you hold your tongue, every kindness you give away adds another brick. By the time you stop to look around, you realize you've built a life worth living. Mine stood steady now, strong enough to carry anyone who needed it. Back home, I opened the windows to let the morning light in. It spilled across the room, landing on the plaque and the picture on the wall. I touched both lightly, whispering thank you once more. Then I noticed the diary still lying open beside the candle. The last line I had written stared back at me. I no longer need to be seen to know I matter. I smiled, realizing those weren't just words anymore. They were truth. My life had finally caught up to the peace I'd been chasing for decades. That truth felt complete. I spent the rest of the morning cooking breakfast and packing a few meals to take to the volunteers later. As I worked, I hummed that same old tune from my childhood again. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, and sunlight poured through the window, turning the whole kitchen golden. I thought about how strange it was that the smallest moments could feel like the biggest blessings. Sometimes, happiness doesn't announce itself, it just sits quietly beside you while you stir a pot or crack an egg, waiting for you to notice it's already there. After breakfast, I stepped outside with a broom to sweep the porch. The breeze was gentle, carrying faint traces of music from a nearby house. I stopped to listen, recognizing the hymn the church choir used to sing when I was a girl. The lyrics spoke about grace found in ordinary days. I sang along under my breath, letting the melody wrap around me. For a moment, I imagined my mother singing beside me again, her voice strong and steady. It felt like the past had folded into the present, both existing peacefully together. Nothing was missing anymore. Around noon, I walked back to the community center to deliver the meals. The children ran up to greet me, their laughter filling the hallway. Evelyn waved from the kitchen, already teaching a small class how to make biscuits. She looked happy, focused, free. I handed the meals to the volunteers and stayed for a while, helping where I could. Watching them all work together made me realize something simple but profound. No act of kindness ever ends. It ripples out, touching lives you'll never meet. That was the real gift. That was the true legacy worth leaving. As I left the building again, I noticed the pastor had already placed a temporary sign above the kitchen door. It read the Clara May Kitchen, my mother's name. I felt my eyes sting, but I smiled through it. I whispered her name aloud, letting it hang in the air for a moment. It felt like a circle had closed, like everything had come home. I took a deep breath, feeling gratitude rise in me like sunlight after a long storm. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was fulfillment, the kind that settles deep and stays for good. Walking back home, I passed by the church one last time. The bell tower stood tall against the sky. It rang once, clear and slow. The sound rolled through the town, gentle but powerful. I stopped on the sidewalk, listening. Every note felt like a reflection of the life I had built, steady, humble, full of meaning. I whispered one final prayer, not asking for anything, just giving thanks. The sound faded into the distance, but the feeling stayed. It was the kind of peace that doesn't fade, even when everything else does. That evening, I sat on my porch again, the sky painted gold and lavender. The day was ending, and I felt no urge to do or fix or prove anything. I had done enough. I had become enough. The key rested on the table beside me, catching the last bit of sunlight. I thought about every meal, every laugh, every quiet moment that had brought me here. My heart was steady. My story was whole. As the sun slipped behind the trees, I smiled softly to myself, knowing I didn't need anyone to see me anymore. I already did.